The world expected silence. But instead, a thunderclap shook Washington. On September 18, 2025, Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest leader on Earth, delivered a $2.1 billion punch America never saw coming. In Beijing, he tore up the old rules of empire and signed a deal that could end centuries of Western control. And here's the twist. This wasn't just a trade agreement. This was an open declaration that Africa would no longer kneel. Stay with me, because what Traoré set in motion that day has the power to redraw global maps. It began with pressure. Washington believed Burkina Faso was too small, too fragile to resist. They tried to choke its economy with crushing tariffs, betting Traoré would fold. But instead of begging for relief, he flew east. In Beijing, the world watched a scene that flipped the balance of power. Traoré, flanked by Chinese officials, penning a zero-tariff trade pact worth $2.1 billion. No quotas, no restrictions, no hidden conditions. Just raw lifeline energy injected into a land the West thought was already broken. To many in Africa, it was more than economics. It was defiance carved into history. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a pawn, had struck the empire across the face. Traoré wasn't just signing papers. He was signing away the myth that Africa had no options. And here's where the story turns darker. In Washington's corridors, shock turned to fury. The reaction came fast. Sanctions on 47 Burkinabe officials. Swift restrictions designed to strangle Chinese payments. Troop deployments along neighboring borders, raising the specter of conflict. Western media moved in, pushing the same old narrative. Debt traps, Chinese colonialism, false promises. But this time, it didn't land. Because Traoré's deal wasn't written on America's terms. Payments in yuan, infrastructure routed through East African ports, legal protections sealed outside U.S. courts. For the first time in living memory, Washington's economic arsenal hit nothing but air. In the cafés of Ouagadougou, a whisper spread like wildfire. America can't touch us anymore. Think about that. A nation once defined by dependency suddenly felt untouchable. But here's the cliffhanger. When an empire blinks, it rarely backs away. The real question is, would the West dare to strike harder? Traoré's move rippled far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Mali, in Niger, in the streets of Accra, people asked the same question. Could we do this too? If Burkina Faso could break the chain, maybe others could snap their shackles. And that's what terrified Washington most. Not the money, not the deal, but the possibility of contagion. Because empires survive not just on resources, but on the illusion that resistance is impossible. Now, that illusion had been shattered. And once a crack appears, history tells us it spreads. But will Africa's freedom rise from this crack? Or will the empire hammer it shut with force? What do you think? Did Traoré just light the fuse of Africa's independence? Or has he drawn his people into the crosshairs of a storm they can't escape? Let me know in the comments, because this is the debate echoing in every capital right now. Here's the chilling part. For Washington, the playbook is familiar. Sanctions, isolation, destabilization. But in 2025, something has changed. The global south is no longer watching passively. Russia, China, even Gulf states are circling, eager to back a leader willing to defy the old order. And that's why this $2.1 billion deal matters. It wasn't just an economic lifeline. It was a signal flare, a message broadcast to the world that the smallest nations can say no. But history reminds us, when the smallest nations stand tallest, empires don't just retreat, they retaliate. The stage is set, the whispers are louder, and what happens next could decide not just Burkina Faso's future, but Africa's. So here's the truth. Whether you see Traoré as a hero or a gambler, one thing is undeniable. He's forcing the world to pay attention. And if his courage resonates with you, hit that subscribe button, because the stories of Africa's struggle for freedom must be told. And together, we'll make sure they're never silenced. One spark in West Africa just set the continent on fire when Ibrahim Traoré turned Washington's ultimatum into a $2.1 billion lifeline with China. No one expected what followed. But within weeks, the dominoes began to fall, and the empire that once controlled Africa's gold, uranium, and oil started losing its grip. And here's the part that terrifies Washington the most. It wasn't just Burkina Faso breaking free. Suddenly, Mali, Niger, Chad, Guinea all began walking away from Europe's contracts, from France's monopolies, from America's threats. The chains that held the continent together for centuries were cracking in real time. Stay until the end, because this domino effect might not just redraw Africa's future. It could rewrite the entire world order. Burkina Faso's defiance lit the fuse, but Mali delivered the explosion. For decades, French mining companies extracted Mali's gold under suffocating contracts, funneling billions back to Paris while leaving Malian villages in poverty. Everyone assumed those deals were untouchable, but weeks after Traoré's Beijing handshake, Bamako stunned the world. A $1.8 billion Chinese mining partnership. Overnight, the monopoly shattered. No more French dominance. No more one-way flow. For Mali, it wasn't just business. It was liberation written in stone and dust. Young Malians celebrated in the streets. For the first time, their gold felt like their gold. And across the region, whispers grew louder. If Mali can do this, why not us? But this was only the beginning. Next came Niger, the beating heart of Europe's uranium supply. For decades, French reactors glowed on Niger's resources, while Niamey remained in darkness. The injustice was infamous. A land that powered Europe couldn't power its own homes. Then, in a move no one thought possible, Niger struck a $2.3 billion processing deal. Not with France, not with the EU, but with China. For the first time, uranium would be refined in Africa, by Africans for African gain. To Washington and Paris, this wasn't just economics. It was betrayal. It was a nation tearing up the invisible script of dependency. And to millions watching online, it felt like history's scales tipping back toward justice. But then, the next domino fell. Chad, long dismissed as an oil-rich pawn, refused to stay silent. Negotiations began for a Chinese-built refinery, an end to the cycle of pumping crude out and buying it back at inflated prices. It was a demand for sovereignty written in barrels of black gold. And then came Guinea, a $3.4 billion aluminum project unveiled with fanfare. One of Africa's richest bauxite reserves, once a symbol of foreign exploitation, suddenly became a promise of national wealth. Do you see the pattern? One nation after another, drawing courage from Burkina Faso's defiance. What the West once considered isolated sparks were now igniting into a continent-wide blaze. And here's where the numbers tell a brutal truth. US-Africa trade has collapsed to just $31 billion, a fraction of what it once was. Meanwhile, China-Africa trade has exploded past $340 billion, and it isn't slowing down. On social media, the shift is undeniable. Hashtags like #TradePivot racked up 890 million impressions in a single month. Videos of young Africans learning Mandarin flood TikTok. Universities launch business courses focused on Beijing instead of Brussels. Engineers file patents from labs that didn't even exist 3 years ago. This isn't just a trend, it's a tectonic shift. And to Washington, it's a nightmare, because the empire is shrinking and a new map is being drawn in real time. But will the West accept defeat? Or will it launch a new kind of war to chain Africa once more? What do you think? Is this Africa's second independence, or just the opening battle of a bigger struggle? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective matters as much as the events themselves. What began as one defiant deal in Ouagadougou has spiraled into something bigger than borders. It's the domino effect the West feared most, a momentum that no single sanction, no single media campaign can contain. The question is no longer whether Africa can resist. It's whether the old powers can survive the collapse of the system they built. The whispers are louder, the dominoes are falling, and the storm has only just begun. If Traore's defiance and Africa's awakening strike a chord with you, don't just watch, be part of this journey. Hit subscribe, because these stories matter. The empire's playbook is fading, but the voice of Africa is rising. And together, we will make sure the world hears it. Make no mistake, what Ibrahim Traoré unleashed wasn't just a trade deal. It was a declaration of war against an empire. And the empire struck back. Cyberattacks, blacklists, shadow operations, even whispers of assassination. But here's the twist. The more they tried to crush him, the stronger he became. And that's what terrifies the West. Because this wasn't a simple struggle over tariffs or contracts. This was survival. A small African nation, led by its youngest captain, suddenly became the center of a storm. Washington thought they could force Traoré to bend. Instead, they may have triggered a revolution no military can stop. Stay with me, because the story you're about to hear will explain why the West may have already lost a war it hasn't even admitted fighting. The retaliation began quietly, but it didn't stay quiet for long. Within weeks of the $2.1 billion deal with China, Western powers launched something they called Operation Trade Disruption. First came the cyberattacks. Banks in Ouagadougou suddenly froze. ATMs stopped working. Digital transactions vanished into thin air. Panic flickered. But Traoré moved fast, rolling out backup systems powered by African developers. The attack failed. Then came the currency games. The CFA franc, tied to French oversight, swung violently as Western markets manipulated exchange rates. Overnight, imports doubled in price. But instead of surrender, Burkina Faso turned to direct barter trade with allies. Grain for fuel, gold for medicine. The lifelines held. Insurance companies were next. Ships bound for African ports were blacklisted, premiums skyrocketing, until delivery seemed impossible. But China rerouted cargo through alternate corridors, and East African ports opened their gates. And in the shadows, 340 million flowed into opposition movements. Paid rallies, smear campaigns, radio stations blasting anti-Traoré propaganda. But the more they shouted, the more the people rallied behind their captain. And here's where it gets darker. NATO troops staged exercises just miles from Burkina Faso's border, and intelligence leaks whispered of assassination plots. This wasn't diplomacy, it was war. But then, something unexpected happened. For most nations, this level of pressure would have been unbearable. For Burkina Faso, it became fuel. Instead of folding, the country surged. Technology centers in Ouagadougou, once modest hubs, began rolling out patents at a pace no one saw coming. Innovations in agriculture, drones for mining, software designed for African markets, women-led cooperatives, long sidelined by foreign corporations, began turning shea butter into global exports. Products once undervalued in Western markets suddenly gained prestige in Asia and the Middle East. And the economy, what was supposed to collapse, tripled average incomes in just 18 months. For the first time, farmers, students, and workers saw independence not as a dream, but as daily reality. But here's the micro hook. The more Burkina Faso rose, the more Africa watched. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Bamako to Accra, youth saw proof with their own eyes. Independence works. And that's what scared Washington most. If you want to understand why the empire is afraid, Don't look at the balance sheets. Look at the people. In cafes and universities, young Africans rallied around Traoré's defiance. Not because he was perfect, not because he was invincible, but because he represented something they had been told was impossible: freedom without permission. Across the continent, hashtags like #TraoréFect trended. Songs were written. Street art appeared overnight, painting walls with slogans of resistance. This wasn't just politics. It was culture, identity, fire. And every time Western media painted Traoré as reckless, it only deepened his legend. To Africa's youth, the attacks against him became proof he was onto something powerful. But then came the shadow no one could ignore: NATO's growing presence. History shows us that when economic warfare fails, the next step is often military. And in West Africa, NATO's footprint grew heavier. Training missions, drone bases, joint exercises, staged dangerously close to the Sahel. Whispers of proxy wars began spreading. Could destabilization campaigns erupt? Could neighboring states be pulled into conflict? And here lies the cliffhanger. The harder the West pushed, the more Africans united. But unity doesn't guarantee survival. With NATO's shadow expanding, the revolution faces its greatest test yet. So, what do you think? Can Traoré's revolution outlast the Empire's playbook, or will the pressure finally break him? Drop your thoughts below, because the stakes aren't just for Burkina Faso, they're for all of Africa. Here's the paradox. Every move designed to weaken Traoré ended up strengthening his cause. The sanctions, the cyberattacks, the shadow campaigns, they all backfired. Instead of silencing him, they amplified his voice. Instead of isolating him, they drew allies closer. What began as one trade deal has now transformed into a revolution of pride, of sovereignty, of imagination. A small nation has become a beacon, and empires built on centuries of control are finding that the old tools no longer work. The war they tried to wage is one they can't win. If Traoré's defiance inspires you, don't let this story fade into silence. Subscribe now, because the world needs to hear that Africa is not bending, it is rising. And together, we'll keep telling the stories the Empire doesn't want you to know.